10 Common Questions about SOC Compliance was a live webinar that was originally produced on Thursday, March 26th. For this webinar, we were joined by Michael Hoffner, Managing Partner and Leader of McKonly and Asbury's Systems and Organization Controls Practice, and Josh Bantz, Senior Manager and key team member in the SOC practice. We hope you enjoy this recap, and please visit us online at macpas.com for more information about our future webinars and other events.
Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar entitled 10 Common Questions about SOC Compliance. My name is Mike Hoffner. I'm Managing Partner and Leader of McKonly and Asbury's System and Organization Controls Practice. Joining me today is Josh Bantz, Senior Manager in our practice and one of our key team leaders in this particular practice area. So we look forward to the next hour speaking a little bit about SOC and some of the common questions that were asked by prospective clients and clients that are just getting ready to go down this path. So as we get started, just wanted to take a minute and talk about a few things that are on our minds today as we get into things. First and foremost is the question of why are we doing a SOC webinar in the midst of a pandemic with more important things on our minds? And quite frankly, the team here at McKonly and Asbury really wrestled with that question. Wrestled with the idea of whether this was the appropriate time for this or if we should focus resources on more pressing and pertinent things with what's going on in our communities and in our world. But ultimately, we understood that business is still continuing. Service organizations are a critical part of what's keeping things moving and allowing a lot of the essential businesses and life-saving businesses to do what they do. And so in that mindset, we thought it's good information. We still get these questions. We continue to get these questions. So we're gonna continue on. We're gonna have our webinar today. We're gonna archive it so those who can't join us today because of more pressing things are able to listen later. But we are cognizant of what's going on, but still thought it was important. Second thing to touch base on is the webinar process. Normally here at the firm, when we do a webinar, we have our entire team in our studio, all looking at each other in the eye, working together to make sure things are going normal. We have 4 of us today collaborating here on this webinar on the McKonly and Asbury side. It's Josh and I, and then our folks who are actually making sure all the technology works and that we keep on track. And we're in 4 different locations. So I say that only to ask for your grace and forgiveness if things aren't quite as seamless and perfect, but we'll do our best here. Third thing is relative to CPE. For those who have joined our webinars in the past, you know that our practice is to provide a series of polling questions throughout the webinar. And with those polling questions, your answers to those are evidence of your attendance. The National Association of State Boards of Accountancy requires us to do those things to provide CPE. But because of the way we're doing things remotely today, it'll be a little bit different. Instead of polling questions throughout the course of the webinar, I will be giving you a series of 3, I will call them CPE words. Words that are simple to remember and relevant, but if you write them down as I say them, immediately after the webinar, you will receive, once you exit out of the software, you'll receive a survey, and in that survey will be a comment question at the very end, open-ended question for any comments you have, and we would ask you to kindly fill those 3 words I'm going to give you into the comment section. That'll be our evidence to those that oversee our ability to provide CPE, that we actually did this live and that you were paying attention. So a little bit different this time, but we think it should allow us to still provide those CPE certificates that are necessary for many of you. Final thing to touch on is our agenda and any prerequisites that we may have. And I say that to simply say this: there are no prerequisites for this course. We designed this course and the agenda to answer the questions that Josh and I and others in our firm get asked all the time by companies that don't have a SOC but are being asked for one, or may be told they need one and haven't really explored what it is. So these are really entry level. I'll call this a SOC 101 type course, an introduction introduction to SOC, real basic questions. So if you are very well versed on SOC and very deep into a SOC process at your organization, be warned in advance, you might not find this quite as interesting as others who are really trying to figure out how to go down this path for the first time. So with that, we will move into our 10 common questions. So we're going to start by just laying out for you what those questions are, and then Josh and I will go through, and I'll give him the microphone here in a little bit so he can just jump into our first couple of questions. So I'm going to read through them fast so that you know what's coming for the next hour. The first question we get all the time: what's a SOC report? Why is it important? Why am I being asked for these things? Once we answer that at a high level, we'll talk through some of the types of reports that are available and how you determine which one you need, because there are multiple options. You'll hear about type 1 and type 2. We'll answer what those things are and what that means. Then the question we often get is, I'm told I need a SOC report, but I have no idea what it covers. How do I figure that out? So we'll talk through that. And that goes beyond just an overall what it should cover, but how I choose the level of detail I get into, what kinds of controls I look for. The last series of questions one's about timing. We'll get through some of the details on how long this process takes, because we get that question all the time. We'll talk about organizations that may support you and how they factor into a SOC engagement. And then we always get the question, is this a once and done? Do I have to do this again? So we'll talk about what the process looks like and answer that one. And then Josh's favorite, I know that he'll get into, is this idea of how you can or maybe cannot become SOC certified. And then finally, what is the resource requirement in your organization? What do I need? We hear that a lot. Do I need to hire somebody to help through this process? So we'll talk about that. And then Josh and I do have a bonus question, which we'll close out with, that we get on virtually every conversation we have. And I don't know if you'll all love the answer, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So before I turn the mic over to Josh to talk about our first couple of questions that we want to walk through today, I want to give you your first CPE word. So if you jot this down, again, you will be asked in your comment section of your survey that you'll get at the end of this webinar to fill in 3 words I'll give you. So the first word is controls. Controls. So jot that down and save it for later. So with that, Josh, I'm going to turn it over to you to continue into our first question.
So good afternoon, everyone. The first question that we generally get, and get maybe the most often from prospective clients, is, what is a SOC report and why is it important and why am I being asked for it? So what is a SOC report? A SOC report is a system and organization controls report that CPAs provide for clients who, those clients are generally service organizations, and I can define a service organization as an organization that does perform services for other entities, such as data centers from the IT perspective, or a payroll processor is a good example, where a service such as payroll is being provided to other entities. So and what the SOC report really does is it provides the customer or the service organization with a report certified by a CPA that identifies their key controls at a system level and entity level controls that they can provide to other organizations. And it's an auditor to auditor communication. And the idea behind this communication is that it allows users of service organizations to be able to rely on specific controls and specific processes that those service organizations perform. And it allows users of service organizations to assess risks as they outsource services. What you'll see, and many of you may have often seen, is over time, as you begin to respond to RFPs and respond to new business opportunities, you'll see often that SOC reports are one of the requirements, and that's due to the prospective customer reviewers often requiring them to assess the risks of all their outsourced service organizations that they're using. And one of the ways they do that is through obtaining a SOC report for those service organizations. Why is it important? I kind of answered that, but it communicates important information to your customers all in one place concerning service organizations' controls. If you are a service organization, it obviously is something that you provide to your customers, that your customers can rely on the control environment that you have in place and the processes you have in place. If you're a user of a SOC report, then it obviously allows you to monitor and evaluate the controls and the control environment and processes at the service organizations that you're used. So it is a very key report in assessing risk and in understanding the various aspects of service organizations. Why am I being asked for it? Users of service organizations are relying on the work that service organization does for a very specific and particular tasks, whether it be payroll processing or data hosting, depending on the specific environment. And because of that, they want to be able to have that understanding of what processes and what controls are in place to ensure that the service that they're receiving, whether it be data hosting, payroll processing, it is being done in an environment that provides accurate and secure controls. So it allows the users to assess the health of the control environment of the service provider, and that obviously is one of the key aspects of why it's being used. Is obviously user entities want to know that they're obviously having their data hosted in a data center example with a organization that has sound controls over the physical environment that the data is being hosted in. So the other aspects of why you're being asked for it, oftentimes we see that customer contracts and contracts from that service organizations enter into require that they receive a SOC report. As I said earlier, RFPs have kind of gone to the method where a lot of RFPs that we see, and we have a lot of clients that see RFPs where they're required before they can submit a proposal for a new customer, they have to obtain a SOC report. And I think that's a consistent thing across the board, and we're also seeing a lot in the vendor management area where larger organizations that use service organizations have vendor management groups, and they're requiring SOC reports for all their vendors. So it's consistently been something that there's been a lot of activity around in the last few years. So the other reason is their auditor told them they had to get it from you. That's generally one of the ways it starts. Like I said earlier, it's an auditor to auditor communication. So it's certainly something where, as auditors are in doing, whether it be a financial statement audit or an IT assessment, they're requiring customers to get SOC reports from all of the vendors that they're using and the service organizations that they're using. The next question that we have is, how do I determine what type of report I need? This is another one of the probably the most significant areas that we see, and it's also probably one of the most high volume questions that we get all the time is, what report do we need? So there's several different types of SOC reports. There is a SOC 1, a SOC 2, and a SOC 3, and I'll dive in here a little bit to each of those. But a SOC 1 report is a report that deals with the internal control over financial reporting at a service organization. So in the example I provided earlier where I talked about data centers and I talked about payroll processing, in that case, the SOC 1 would apply to payroll processing in most cases, because essentially the service organization is performing a task that is involved in the financial reporting of their user entities. So processing payroll, providing reports on what payroll was processed to their user entities, and those user entities then in turn recording financial statement information based on those reports. That would imply a SOC 1, because you're providing a report that details the internal controls over the payroll processing, which would be part of the financial reporting. A SOC 2 is a internal control over processing of storage of user data. It's based upon the AICPA trust services criteria, which the trust services criteria are the criteria for security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, and privacy. And the SOC 2 is intended for users who may store data. They may be software as a service, where basically they're providing a trust type of activity on behalf of another organization. So we often see SOC 2s in the information technology space, where there be a data center. In the example I gave earlier as well, data centers were a perfect example of a SOC 2. They provide a place where servers can be housed in a secure facility, obviously that protects data for customers. So the SOC 3 is nearly identical to a SOC 2 in that it's internal controls over processing or storage of user data in accordance with the trust service criteria. The primary difference with a SOC 3 is that it is a public use report. A SOC 1 and a SOC 2 are restricted use reports. They're restricted to the use by customers of the service organization and or prospective customers of the service organization. A SOC 3 report is for public use. It's a redacted version, I would say, of a SOC 2. It has substantially less information in it than the SOC 2. However, it still provides an opinion whether the internal controls at the service organization were in accordance with the trust services criteria. So, I think the best way to put it would be a SOC 2 is something you would provide to customers and prospective customers only. A SOC 3 is something you can post out on a web page for the public to view. The next bullet point down, as I finish going through those, is your customers do not always ask for the right thing is a huge topic for us. We see this so often where we have, we've not seen somebody ask for a SOC 4 yet, which is surprising, but we've seen everything pretty much you can imagine with, SOC 2 type 1, SOC 3 type 2, different variations of people asking for very different things. And what we have seen is that a lot of user entities are not really familiar with exactly what type of SOC report they should be looking for. So I think it's really important as you begin to be asked for a SOC report or begin to start down the path of doing a SOC report, understanding what you do for your customers and what they're relying on you to do, and understanding that to determine which type of SOC report you should be getting. Obviously, as I said earlier, if you're a data center, we really wouldn't tend to see you in the SOC 1 space as much as, in the same, if you're a payroll provider, we would generally see you in the SOC 1 space and not so much in the SOC 2 space, but it also depends on what you're doing for them in that specific customer. So it's certainly something to understand and to reach out as you receive requests for a SOC report. Before you've actually done a SOC report, reach out to your auditor or to McKonly and Asbury about what specifically is being asked for, so that you can get an understanding of that.
Yeah, Josh, I think, Josh, that's an important part when those contract adjustments come in or RFPs come in and specifically ask for a SOC X type Y. Before you sign off on that, knowing you're going to finally need to go get a SOC report, I would encourage a phone call to us, to your auditor, because sometimes we see clients or prospects sign a contract that says they're committing now as part of this to, within 1 year, get a SOC 1 type 1 or a SOC 1 type 2 when we know that's not the right service. So just an encouragement, before you sign that contract and send it back, you have an opportunity to jump in and actually get the contract language correct before you commit yourself to something that then you're going to have to say, no, this isn't the right thing. I need to modify this contract I just signed. So just wanted to highlight that. But yeah, keep going, Josh. Sorry.
No, that's a great point, Mike. Like I said, we've come in on the back end of these things where people have agreed, customers have sent out requests that were incorrect, and you had to work through the contracts phase to get it corrected because they didn't ask for the right thing. So I certainly think that that's something that's very, very important before you agree to anything, is understanding what you're agreeing to and that it's the correct thing that you should be agreeing to. So, and then understanding.
Josh,
yes.
Real quick before you go on to the next one, we did have a question to clarify a statement you made about a SOC 3, and I understood what you were trying to say, being a redacted version of a SOC 2. Just to clarify, and it's a great question, it is not a redacted version. It is, I think what Josh was alluding to, is it is a significantly shortened version with a lot of the details that would be in a SOC 2 excluded from a SOC 3 as opposed to a black-lined SOC 2 that's published with just a lot of pieces missing. So just wanted to clarify that. Great question from one of our listeners who asked that, so wanted to jump in and get that cleared up.
That's a great clarification on that. Yeah, redacted is not the correct word. It doesn't include all of the controls being presented in it. It's a more summarized version of the SOC 2 would be a better way to state that. So thank you for the question. Glad we could get you a clarification. As far as understanding vendor versus service organization, this is another concept that you really have to understand as you're beginning to get asked for a SOC report. Are you really doing, do you really provide a service to your user entities that includes a control environment that you perform controls over and that they rely on the work that you're doing for them as it relates to a trust type of criteria in a SOC 2 where you're dealing with processing storage of user data, and or in a SOC 1 environment where you're dealing with financial reporting. Certainly there's environments where you're specifically a vendor and you're not a service organization. You providing one specific aspect of something to them where it doesn't follow through a process on your end is certainly puts you more into a vendor category. But it is a very gray line between what is the difference between a vendor and a service organization. And that's something that, as you start to see, contracts come through with SOC requirements in them and or RFPs, really trying to define that line in reaching out and using the resources available to you to understand what it specifically is you do for the user entities that they're asking for this. Because certainly you don't want to go through the process of getting a SOC report if you're have a very minimal impact on your user entity that's asking for it, and you're not really providing a true service to them. In addition to SOC 1, SOC 2, and SOC 3, there's also a SOC for cybersecurity and a SOC for supply chain. These are two SOC reports that are fairly new to the market for the ASCPA, and they're generally an internally driven report, as it says there. They're not generally driven from user requests or if you're the service organization, it's not because your customers are asking for these. These are reports that report more internally to a internal audit group or to board of directors, so forth. So they're focused more internally, so that we don't necessarily see those from the perspective of how we see the SOC 1, SOC 2, and SOC 3. And the primary focus of this webinar will be on the SOC 1, SOC 2, and SOC 3 needs, because it is a customer-driven report in that perspective. So the next question that we get quite often is, what is the difference between a type 1 and a type 2 report? So SOC 1 and SOC 2s have type 1 and type 2 reports, and you'll often see confusion in requests that you may get about whether they want a type 1 or a type 2, or sometimes they just say they want a SOC 2. Sometimes they confuse a SOC 1 type 2 with a SOC 2. Once again, that kind of goes back to the last set of slides where we talked about that last question about making sure you understand what they're asking for. So a type 1 report is in effect an evaluation, a conclusion, and an opinion from the auditor over the design of the controls as of a point in time. So as of today, March 26th, we have evaluated the design of the service organization's controls, and we feel that those controls are designed effectively, and if operating effectively, will work to appropriately, cover the system that is being, the service organization performs. There is no testing of the effectiveness of controls over a period of time in a type 1 report. The report will literally be as of date X, whether it's December 31st, March 31st, June 30th, whatever the date may be, and it's specific to that date and time. In a type 1, we also, as I said, we don't test the operating effectiveness of controls over time. We generally gain an understanding of the users and control environment. We understand their controls. We perform walkthroughs of the controls just to ensure that what the user, the service organization says their controls are actually what's in effect happening. However, we don't test whether those controls are working over a period of time. And generally what we like to say about a type 1 report is that it's generally not accepted by most auditors as evidence of a sound control environment because it speaks to a specific date and time, and you really can't apply that date and time in those controls, back for the 6-month period preceding or 8 or 9 months or 12 months preceding that type 1 report. So it's generally used. You may ask the question of why would you get one then? Oftentimes we've seen it in instances where a service organization who may be a startup or is a new company wants to get a SOC report out so that they can provide some evidence that they have some type of a control environment in the short-term period, for their potential new customers, and that gives them an opportunity to say, well, as a new company, we have just started up, and here's a SOC report that provides evidence as to what our control environment and how it was designed as of this date and time, as given that there wasn't a period to be able to test. So that's the primary purpose for it, and we see some other uses for it depending on contractual requirements and how soon SOC reports need to get out for various RFPs and things like that. There can be some other opportunities to kind of use a SOC type 1 to kind of mitigate some of those contractual requirements until you can get a SOC 2 performed. So the SOC 2 report provides a evaluation, conclusion, and opinion over both the design of the controls as well as the operating effectiveness of the controls. And a SOC or a type 2 report is over a period of time. So when you are reviewing or reading a SOC report, if it is a type 2 report, it will state that the design of the controls were, the controls were designed effectively and they were operating effectively for the period, July 1 through March 31st. And generally what that's stating is that, not only were the controls designed to work effectively, but they also are operating effectively, and the auditor would have tested those controls over a period of time. So if you, in effect, say that, every employee annually signs an employee handbook, that employee handbook verifying that they receive the employee policies and employee handbook, we, as the auditor, they would have tested a listing of those employees to ensure that those employees actually did do that. And it basically takes the controls and tests those controls to make sure that not only were they in place, but they were working during that period. So, and that's something that the type 1 does not do. And the type 2 is generally what has become the industry standard for users and customers in the SOC world. We, as I said earlier, the type 1 is not something we see that often, and the type 2 is generally what we see being requested. I've already answered the question why an organization would decide on a type 1. So I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Mike for the next question, the next fourth question that we have.
Good, thanks, Josh. So the first 3 questions really were geared towards an understanding of what type of report I need, and when you get those questions of if a contract simply says I need a SOC report or you need to get a SOC report, those are the things that we really navigate through with our potential customers to understand how we get to this point and what type of report. So once we figured that out, the next question is really geared towards what that report should cover. So I've now figured out I need a SOC 1 or I need a SOC 2. What exactly should that cover? So we're going to break that into 2 pieces. We're going to start with SOC 1 and talk about how you figure out what that should cover. It's really important to understand and to remember that you are not being asked to produce a SOC 1 over your company. Although that may be how your user or your customer defines it, you're really providing a SOC report over a system or a service that you provide. So you need to break it down into that level, and that's what we need to work through in understanding what that SOC needs to cover. So we need to define what the system processes and the outputs that our customers are expecting from us, and then make sure we cover the vast majority of those customers. So Josh used payroll company as an example for a SOC 1 previously. So I'll stay in that space. A payroll company may be expected or required to have a SOC 1, and they may sit down and try and understand what am I covering. So if it's a pretty straightforward company that provides the same payroll products, same resources, same everything for its entire customer base, it becomes fairly easy to define that system that's covered. Unfortunately, or fortunately, as business evolves, a lot of payroll companies also do a lot of other things. They may do HR services. They may have 2, 3, 4, 5 different payroll platforms that are designed for different types of customers: small business, large business, multi-location, single location. And so that payroll company would have to sit down and say, what do my users need? And clearly define in that SOC report, it's over payroll platform A, but not B. And it covers only our payroll services, not our outsourced HR compliance services. Or if it does include those other things, we're going to be real clear and scope that in. So the important thing to remember in a SOC 1 is defining exactly what the service you're providing to your customer that they're asking for the SOC report for. So I do say design it to cover the majority of your customers. I think it's important to not get too granular and say you've agreed to a one-off thing for a single customer. So we have to scope that in, and that might significantly complicate the SOC process. At the same time, if that one customer is the one that's asking for your SOC report, obviously you need to be responsive to them. So moving to a SOC 2 is really the same idea. It's not about a SOC 2 over company X. It's a SOC 2 over a specific service that you provide. So in Josh's example of a data center or a software as a service provider, it's really focused on what your users expect from you. So as a data center, you may provide the general same breadth of services to all of your users. But there may be some one-offs that you offer, and 2 or 3 of your customers might take advantage of half of the things that you offer. Some might take advantage of all. It's really a process of figuring out, what do I need to cover? Is it everything I do? Generally, we would advise that that's too much. But is it just the basic core that I do for every customer? That's probably a great place to start. But in a SOC 2, when you ask that question of what should I cover, it's really figuring out exactly what you do. So important and relevant, I think, I have it listed here on the slide under SOC 2, but it's really applicable to both, is that question of, what do I do if I have multiple customers that use different services? And that idea of what does it cover may be answered multiple ways. One is you may put everything into one report and just make that SOC report very clear as to what each set of controls relates to. More often than not, though, you'll see customers or service organizations that have multiple service lines. More often than not, they'll do more than one SOC report. So if you have 2 significantly different payroll platforms, you may actually have 2 SOC reports, one over each of the platforms, and you only give them to the customer that uses that specific platform. So just some things to think about as you are defining that. So now we've said what goes into the SOC report in terms of how do I figure out the system to cover. The next question we always work through with our clients, our first-time SOC clients, is now I understand the system. Once I understand the system, how do I choose what goes in the SOC report as far as control objectives or criteria that I have to include? And again, the answer to that is different whether you're looking at a SOC 1 or a SOC 2. So Josh touched on this a little bit in terms of trust services criteria versus control objectives. So let's talk about SOC 1. And it's important to think through, from a SOC 1 perspective, an understanding of what a control objective is and how do you define those. So the way we often work through those with customers is to ask the question of, if you were trying to give assurance to your user that you're doing something they want done, you would start a sentence with these words: controls provide us with reasonable assurance that we do X, Y, and Z appropriately for you. So that might be accuracy of processing, it might be different things, but it's that idea. A control objective is that we are providing reasonable assurance that we're giving you the outcome you want. So that's the baseline to think about when you're trying to determine control objectives in a SOC 1. And then we go from there and say, well, what are the most critical things? What are the things that I know my customer is expecting me to get right? So for, let's use that payroll company idea. So it might be something to the effect of tax withholdings are done in accordance with the entity's or the individual's tax bracket based on most current calculations. Or it might be that withholdings for mandatory withholding items are done according to the user's wishes, the court order's expectations, something to that effect. So your customers expect that as a payroll processor, you're doing it right. You're getting the right pay rates, the right amounts, you're pulling it from the right bank account. So it's that listing of the most important things that your customers know that you need to get right as a service provider, and then putting some context around it in that idea of, again, controls provide me with reasonable assurance that I'm getting these things right for you. One important thing in defining these control objectives is not to ask your customers what's important to them. We've seen that happen in the past, and you will end up being told to do far, far more than you probably think is necessary. And if you don't include all those extra things, your customers probably won't even ask for them, to be frank. So don't ask your customer to define it. You decide what's most important. You decide what you're going to give to them. And after year one, they can come back to you and say, you know, I feel like it's important to my use of you to understand that you do this one extra thing you didn't address, and you can always add another objective into the subsequent year. The other thing we would advise is not to feel an obligation to include everything that you think is important. There is a lot of things that are important to your users, but they're not going to look for them in your SOC report. And it is significant burden on the service organization to try and include everything that they can think of as might be important into that SOC report. So it's really finding the things, again, the term I would use is the most critical objectives, the things that are most important to all of your users. And same thing I said on the last slide in terms of determining what system to cover. You want to keep it relevant to the majority of your customers. Don't get into control objectives that might only be relevant or important to one or two customers, unless those are the customers that are most significant to your book of business and are driving the actual need for the SOC report. So just some things to keep in mind in a SOC 1. So in a SOC 2, very similar thought process, but instead of control objectives that you define, trying to figure out what's most important to your customers, the process in a SOC 2 is really revolving around what of the predefined trust services criteria are the ones that need covered. So Josh already introduced the 5 criteria. You do not have to cover all 5 in a SOC 2. You are required to cover security, which is those requirements are also referred to in our world as the common criteria. So you can include security and nothing else. Many of our clients lump in confidentiality as well because they have data at rest that is supposed to maintain confidentiality. Some, depending on what business you're in, particularly a data center, might be highly interested in availability, uptime. So it's really a selection in a SOC 2 of which of the 5 predetermined trust services criteria are relevant to your client base. The only other thing I would really highlight in that respect is the difference between confidentiality and privacy. Privacy is far more intense and involved to cover in a SOC 2 than confidentiality is, and for the majority of companies, until you get into personally identifiable data or the HIPAA space, a lot of organizations look at the data they hold and know their customers want to know, their users want to know that they have methods in place to keep it confidential. They keep it encrypted at rest and in transit. And we sometimes think the privacy is the same thing, so we should go to privacy. There's social security numbers in my system, so I better address privacy, when in reality, confidentiality is enough. So if it's a question you have, work through it with your service provider. But it's a process in a SOC 2 of saying what is the important data that I process or things I do for my customers, and which of these 5 matter. Same 2 points as I gave on SOC 1. Don't ask your customer what to include. They'll tell you do all 5 because a lot of them might not know any better. And so rather than tell you just to do 1, it's easier to say do all 5, and I'm sure I'll get what I need that way. And also same idea. Don't try and address every single customer and every single thing you do for customers. Address the majority of your customers or the most significant of your customers. So we've now gotten through the what should I do, what kind of report do I need? And once we get past the what kind of report do I need, we got into what should it cover. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the logistics. And I do think the rest of our questions go a little bit quicker in terms of the content than the first ones because they're pretty straightforward. So my customer wants my SOC report tomorrow. We get that a lot. In fact, quite a few times. We get the question of, hey, I need a SOC report. Today is March the 26th. Can you get it done for me so I can get it in their hands by April 30th? And the answer to that is no. The simple answer is no, we cannot. So there's a process and a timeline that needs followed. If you have gotten a SOC report for a long time, then it can be done a lot quicker. We can look back in time to the extent that controls can be tested after the fact. But that's a separate conversation. Really for today, I want to focus on our general timeline for a first-time SOC engagement. That gets us to how long it'll take you to get that report in your hands. So first is what we recommend is called a pre-assessment. And the pre-assessment is really identified as a way that we can map the controls to those objectives or criteria we already talked about, identify gaps, allow you to remediate those, and then where we find the most issue is validating that there's sufficient evidence for us to come in and test the operating effectiveness of those controls. So a lot of times we'll find that 90+% of the controls that are necessary to map to all the objectives or criteria are in place, and we do a little bit of remediation with our clients and help them fill those few gaps, but we find far less than 90% of the controls have appropriate, adequate evidential matter that allows us to pick a sample and test them for operating effectiveness. So a lot of the pre-assessment is involved with making sure that you can demonstrate to somebody that you did what you said you were doing. Pre-assessments, in our experience, can take as little as 4 weeks. It is rare that they go that quickly, but that's when a customer has a pretty good, strong control environment, has somebody they can dedicate to the mapping process to work with us, and really wants to move it through quickly as a high priority. I put question marks for the outer boundaries because some pre-assessments will take, as I said, a little as 4 weeks. Other pre-assessments we've seen extend 2 months, 3 months, 6 months. Some of them will extend into the next calendar year because it's not a critical priority for the organization, and it just gets put to the sidelines, and that's perfectly fine until the customer starts barking for it. So that's your first hurdle to overcome. Second hurdle to overcome is a testing period, and the testing period in a Type 2 report is expected to cover a minimum of 6 months. Most of our clients will do 6 months the first time through, and then many will move to a longer period to cover the longer portion or all of a year. But it's really important to understand that you should, and there's some unique circumstances where it can be less than 6 months the first time you do it. But as a baseline, you need at least 6 months. So when you add a best case pre-assessment of 4 weeks to a 6-month testing period, and then our reporting phase, if we get everything right and our clients allow everything to get into our hands with speed and precision, we can get a report in our clients' hands within 15 days of that period end. But when you do that math, you're at a minimum of 7.5 months, and that's if the pre-assessment goes really well. So when we get that question of I'm getting a lot of pressure for it, I need it right now, can you do it? The answer for a first-time SOC is almost always going to be a minimum of 7 to 8 months, and often closer to a year. But to go back to what Josh mentioned earlier, that's where you can put into play a Type 1. And at the end of pre-assessment, you can put a Type 1 in your customer's hands to at least evidence that you've got a sound control environment, even though no testing was done over the effectiveness of those controls. So It is one of the most common questions we get is how quick can I get it? And that's because a lot of service organizations kick the can down the road until a customer says, as a condition of contract, I have to have this and I have to have it now. And at that point, it's too late to get it done that quickly. So I'm going to move real quick through this question because this can get complicated, the use of other companies that support you. So I'm going to touch base on a very high level. Before I do that, I'm going to give you your second CPE word. So your second CPE word to jot down and include in the comment section of your survey. Second word is SAS 70. Right? Good, solid, old school. We're going to go back in time and talk about how this all started. SAS 70 is your second CPE code word. So let's move on. I rely on other companies to support me. How does that factor into a SOC 1 or SOC 2? And that's where Josh had already talked about this idea of subservice organizations. They're those external parties that provide key components of your control environment to the point where you can't fulfill your control obligations without these folks doing what they do. Really important to consider those and work through those. It is management's responsibility to determine who those subservice organizations are and then figure out how you're going to treat them. So we're going to stick at a pretty high level here. We're going to talk about carve out versus inclusive. And I would encourage you, if you're not sure how this plays into your specific environment, we've got some literature on our website that Josh wrote about it that's pretty comprehensive, or give us a call and we'll talk through it. So carve out method means that you refer to that subservice organization in your report, but you don't actually include their controls. You don't include any details about them. You just refer to what they do, and you refer to your methods and mechanisms for monitoring what they do. So that's a really important part of it. You need to have a way of monitoring and overseeing those subservice organizations. Inclusive method, on the other hand, bakes all of the controls and processes of that subservice organization right into your SOC report. That requires some pretty significant coordination because we, as the CPA firm, would not only need to come and test your controls, we also need to go test their controls, and they would need to be willing to allow us in to provide a written assertion, to provide a representation letter, and all that good stuff. So carve out is what we see most often. We do a few inclusives. Carve out we see a lot because folks have good monitoring in place. The one area you have to be extremely cautious about using a carve out method is if it is a subservice organization that is so significant to your internal controls that without including all the details and data about their controls and processes, you would not be able to give an adequate picture to your users. So complementary subservice organization controls, when it's a carve-out method, those are the things that you really need to make sure the subservice organization is doing to help you with relying. And Josh already talked a little bit about vendors and vendor monitoring. So I'm going to bypass that conversation at this point. So moving on, we're getting there. Our next question is the question about, once we get this done, how do I refresh it? Do I need to do something? And that comes up every single conversation we have. It's okay, we got this 10-month timeline, we're going to get it done, we're going to get it in our clients' hands, then how do we refresh it? And the way we would advise you on that is there is no such thing as a refresh of a SOC report. A SOC engagement focuses on the internal controls. A SOC 2 tests the operating effectiveness of those controls over a period of time. And at the end of the day, controls are so fluid and change so dramatically, particularly IT controls, that you can't rely on controls that were tested last year to assume that information environment or that system environment is still effective today. So a SOC engagement is an annual need. You're going to finish it once. The one thing we can promise you and assure you is that it will be easier in year 2 by far. Pre-assessment's not necessary. The testing is predictable, but there is no refresh. It's an annual process that needs to be done every year, needs to be finished every year, and needs to be submitted to your users every year. And they will continue to ask for it. And if you give them last year's, they will push you back and say it's it's useless to me, I need a new one. There is a general consideration that there's a period of time of about 3 months before those controls are considered to be stale. A lot of folks look at 2 months as the outside of that, but rule of thumb is 2 to 3 months. And if your report is now older than 3 months, there is an assumption that your environment has probably changed enough that it's not as applicable and useful. So we won't get into bridge letters and all that. Some of you are aware of bridge letters and how those play in. So there are some ways to cover some of that gap. But with that, that brings us to our 9th out of our 10 questions, and I'm going to pass it back over to Josh to keep us moving.
Thanks a lot, Mike. Now that you've been through quite a few other of the questions that we had, the next question on our list is, after you've gotten your SOC report, is there any such thing as being SOC certified? So this is something that we see quite often, and it's at some points frustrating, but there's no such thing as being SOC certified. It's not a certification. It is a audit report with an opinion on it as to the results of your design and operating effectiveness of controls. And it is for the interpretation of the user as to whether those controls and that audit opinion, are really, qualified for what they use you as a service organization for. So to state that there is a quote unquote certification, that if you have this certification, every single one of your customers should be able to feel comfortable using you is somewhat incorrect, because you could be performing a service for them that is not part of what's in your SOC report. So kind of get that out of the way kind of initially, it's not SOC certified. So once you've received your report, what can and can't you do with your SOC report? Take credit for it on your website or marketing. You can certainly do a press release and have it on your website. You can put a blurb on your website saying that you obtained your annual SOC report, and that the results of which are available to customers and prospective customers, which is essentially saying that your prospective customers and your customers now know that this is in your possession. You've completed the SOC report process for your annual period, and they can ask you for it, and you can provide them that report. And there's certainly nothing wrong with that. And as I said earlier, it's definitely clarified. It's straightforward. It is not SOC certified. There's no certification. The other thing you really shouldn't do is, and I'll explain why, but it's do not publish your SOC 1 or your SOC 2 report in full on your website. The reason primarily for that is it is a privileged report that is restricted to use to your customers and to your prospective customers and users, and it is not to be published. There's obviously very specific information in there about your control environment. There's very specific information in there in a SOC 2 world about your specific IT environment, including security, potentially firewall information, and so forth. So it really should only be provided to your actual prospective users and stakeholders. We've actually seen where some service organizations have actually put watermarks on their SOC reports with a specific identifying number to be able to track if their SOC report is unauthorized, is distributed in an unauthorized manner by one of their users. They actually know which user it was that was passing that SOC report around. So clearly it's not to be relied on by anybody other than privileged and confidential users. If you do want to publish a SOC report broadly, you should really consider the SOC 3. As I said earlier, it is a summarized version of a SOC 2 that provides detail enough to provide an opinion on how the controls operated and were designed. Provides the same opinion, however, it doesn't provide quite the same detail that a SOC 2 provides, and therefore it's intended to be generally distributed. So if that's the route you choose to go, we certainly would say, if you really want to or feel strongly about publishing it broadly, to consider the SOC 3. Question 10. Do I need a full-time person to facilitate this process? This is a very, very good question, and one that we actually get quite often as we work through the pre-assessment process. But the real answer here is every organization is different. Depending on size, complexity, it really depends on whether you need a full-time person or not. There's obviously in the process of getting an annual SOC report, whether it be a SOC 1, SOC 2, There's ongoing maintenance and documentation of internal controls that is the management's responsibility. And one of the things that, some of the things that we see in doing quite a few SOC engagements is it varies by organization. Some of the larger organizations with multiple departments have obviously assigned somebody that is maybe not full-time specific to that task, but they've been, kind of placed in charge of this process and the entire SOC process. They're trying to coordinate, a IT, network security group. They may be trying to coordinate an HR group. There's various departments involved, and in those types of organizations, it's certainly there's a lot of value in being able to provide that one person who drives and owns the process. In other organizations, we certainly see where one person is the individual who kind of quarterbacks everything, and they don't have quite as large of departments, or they don't have as quantity of departments that have to be coordinated based on the service organization. So it's certainly a something that each organization has to address as they go through the pre-assessment process and how they want to handle it. We certainly recommend that clients tend to identify control owners for each area of control, so you can at least say that this specific area is kind of owned by this person, this team, so that there's a defined line from that perspective. But once again, in an environment where you have 10, 12 people, it's a little more difficult to do that versus a organization with 300 or 400 employees, where you obviously need to have more capacity. So and as we said, who has the capacity to do it, and is it a full-time job? It depends on the organization and the complexity of the controls. If there's a chief compliance officer type of role in place, certainly that role, that person would certainly fit the mold for somebody who would be the driver or the owner of this process as a whole, and kind of delineate it down to the group, various departments from there. So, and the other question that we often get as part of this is what is the full-time person to facilitate this? Is if an organization has an internal audit department, what is the role of internal audit in this? And I certainly think that, one of the things that in an internal audit environment, internal audit certainly can be the driver of this. They're certainly can maintain the controls. They're actually capable of testing some of the controls and maintaining a testing plan for controls, which then the auditor will come in and monitor and check their actual controls. So, all right, now we're going to kick it over to the best part, the bonus question. So I'm going to kick that over to Mike right now.
Good deal, Josh. Hey, we're in the home stretch here. We will be wrapped up by 3 o'clock. So thank you all for sticking in through this. So the bonus question, which we get asked every single time at the end of our first conversation, is simply this: how much does it cost? Before I answer that for you, your final CPE code word is pre-assessment. Pre-assessment. You don't have to spell it right. Josh probably won't. But your final code word is pre-assessment. So how much does it cost? And I suspect you all know the answer I'm about to give, which is simply, it depends. There are so many variables in every SOC engagement we do that it very much depends. And I've listed a lot of the variables here on this slide that need to be considered. And it really has to do with the complexity of the system in the organization, has to do with what types of control objectives you choose. It really heavily dependent on the number and nature of controls to manage those objectives. Are they manual controls, system controls? Are controls different at different locations? How many employees, to Josh's example early in our discussion of employees having to acknowledge receipt of a security training? Our testing is different if there's 5,000 employees versus 6 employees. So the only way we can really give a good answer on a range of potential cost is to actually sit down and have a conversation. I can tell you that it's a little bit easier to scope on an initial conversation after learning about the company and the system. It's a little easier to give a range of fees for a SOC 2 because the trust services criteria are predefined and fairly clear. In a SOC 1, it's almost impossible to give a range of potential costs because we don't know what the control objectives that you have in mind are, and we really don't know exactly what that'll flesh out to until we get into some pre-assessment type discussions. So with that, we would invite a conversation. We would invite a dialogue with you on how we can help you get to an understanding of what that cost would be. And at the end of that initial dialogue, we can give you a range of what we think it would be, and then we generally, at the end of pre-assessment, can give a precise amount. So those are the most common questions that we get on SOC reports. The one thing that I think Josh and I would point out, we've answered a lot of questions for you as it relates to how you get something in the hands of your users that will be meaningful. I think it is important to acknowledge that the vast majority of our clients, after going through their first year SOC, also find significant internal organizational benefit to having put specifics around what are those key objectives we're trying to manage, what are the key controls we have in place, and most will come out the other side believing that they have a better process, better systems, and a more controlled environment, which makes everybody feel better. So there is value in going through the SOC process, aside from just handing your users and your customers a report at the end of the day. So we will invite you to reach out to us with any questions you have. On behalf of McKonly and Asbury, thank you for joining us. A recap of the webinar will be posted to the website next week, and for those that need CPE certificates, they will be sent out in the next few weeks. Please don't forget to weigh in with those 3 code words when you fill out the survey that will come out as soon as you exit the webinar, so that we have that evidence for the folks that watch over our shoulders to make sure we're doing this the right way. The other thing I would say to be on the lookout for is our next webinar, which is currently scheduled for April 30th, where we will give a presentation on preparing for the new leasing standard. So a little bit different focus than SOC for service organizations and how we look at things there, but that'll be coming up April 30th at 2 o'clock. And as things evolve with the COVID-19 crisis and the things that are evolving with opportunities for companies to apply for aid, for some HR things that are coming out, there may be additional information, and McKonly and Asbury also will be keeping our clients as updated as we possibly can via our website. So look for some information there specific to COVID-19 and any questions you might have on relief packages and things from a business perspective that could be of use. So thank you for joining us in today's webinar. Stay safe, stay healthy, practice social distancing, and please remember to wash your hands. Most importantly, thank you for what each of you are doing to keep your businesses moving forward and supporting the communities around you through this tough time. Thanks.